hands are
All right, welcome to the local ARE chapter and to whoever may be tuning in over the internet. We will be streaming this class tonight as well for persons at a distance who may not be able to attend. So. Although I've introduced myself to each of you, I'll say again, I'm Christopher Gibson. I'm going to be your presenter tonight. As is typical with my classes, we have a lot of information to cover. That's just sort of what happens when I start preparing. So, are there any questions before I start? Yes, ma'am.
Since I'm extremely brand new, is there actually an Albuquerque chapter of the ARE that meets regularly?
Yes, and they're in the room with you.
Yes.
And I'm actually, with the exception of Diane and Susan, I'm meeting all of you for the first time tonight.
Okay.
So I'm sort of the stranger here too. And they can give you information about when and where they meet before the end of the evening. We're going to go for about an hour, then we'll take a short break in case your dinner's settled and you need dessert, which you can find in the kitchen, and to change the tape. We're both taping and streaming for archival purposes. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. That was Carl Gustav Jung. All right, Tarot origins. No one knows for certain when Tarot cards originated or for what purposes they were originally designed. Here you have a sampling of cards spread over the centuries. The findings of historians and researchers differ greatly from the folklore and oral traditions of occultists. And this is something I'm going to talk a lot about tonight, is that there are things about Tarot for which we have hard historic evidence, and then there are things about Tarot that are really assigned into the oral tradition, for which there is not always evidence to substantiate it, other than the tradition that's passed on. It's believed that the first playing cards were introduced to Spain during the Islamic occupation. A card game originally of Arabic origin called Tarocchi appeared in mid-15th century Italy. The Visconti Sforza deck from the mid-15th century are the oldest existing Tarot cards. The major arcanum of the Tarot, originally not numbered, were referred to as triumphi, or triumphs, which evolved into the English term trumps. According to historians, the game of Tarocchi made its way from the courts of Milan to Marseille, France, eventually spreading to all of Europe. At some point, Tarot cards were used for divination as well as a game. During the French occult revival, more esoteric origins were assigned to the cards. Tarot decks are now found in most countries, and they've been altered by the different countries and cultures that have basically had contact with them. So here you can see we have Egyptian style decks, French, Hungarian, another French deck, an English deck, a more contemporary deck done in a Russian lacquerware style, And even on the extreme edge, everyone who's an artist now does a tarot deck. This was a tarot deck based on the mythology of the Wizard of Oz.
Okay.
Christopher, one of our listeners wanted to know that she downloaded the brochure and will be able to get handouts for this class later.
I believe so. The handouts were just finished yesterday, and I didn't give enough lead time. So we'll make sure that the handouts get uploaded to the website where they can collect them. So within a few days, they should be up there. And my apologies that you don't have them in your hands tonight. Now, in the late 18th century, a manuscript titled Egyptian Mysteries started to circulate in European occult circles, which described the rites of Egyptian initiation and placed the tarot images on pillars within an initiation chamber. This manuscript was attributed to Iamblichus, a Neoplatonist of the 4th century Christian era, who had authored on the mysteries, particularly those of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians. The manuscript was translated from the original German into Dutch, and the Dutch edition was translated in English in 1988 and published by Samuel Weiser. The book has been out of print for some time. Occasionally one can find a used copy. Now, modern scholarship doubts the antiquity of the manuscript, assigning its creation to the late 1700s. There's much speculation as to who authored this manuscript, which surfaced in Bavaria around the same time as the Rosicrucian Enlightenment and Egyptian Masonry. Among the early authors on what we would call the occult tarot, as opposed to the tarot as used as a game of playing cards. These occult authors used the tarot to encode Hermetic and Kabbalistic ideals, assigning different Hebrew letters and astrological signatures to the major arcanum or trump cards. One of these authors, somehow my notes. This is Comte de Saint-Germain, born 1710, lived till 1784. Hey, Samara. He was an occultist, an alchemist, a hermeticist, and a mason. And he was one of the original writers on the occult tarot who viewed the tarot as being a depository of ancient wisdom. A contemporary and quite an influential character in the French court was Antoine de Jablong. He also was in the 18th century. He was a Protestant pastor, not very popular in France in those days. They were constantly killing one another. So it was, hordes would descend upon the Protestants and massacre them, and then, Protestants would retaliate and eliminate Catholics. So much like North Ireland in recent decades. But he wrote a key book at the time, Le Monde Primitif, and he is the first person to suggest that the tarot actually came from Egypt. And he said that the word tarot means royal road or royal path, referring to the royal path to adeptship. Now, there is actually no evidence that it means that in Egyptian, but this is where that concept was first introduced into tarot cards and tarot tradition. Etea, which is actually Jean-Baptiste Elias, spelled backwards. Again, 18th century, the first professional tarotist. And he published the core theory and practice of the Book of Thoth in 1790. And what he did in that writing was, he was the first author that we know of to place in writing the tarot as being a form of Hermetic wisdom or coming from Hermes Trismegistus, known as Thoth in Egypt. And he was also the first person to assign both Kabbalistic and astrological signatures to the tarot. The much maligned Cagliostro, also 18th century, started to reform European masonry into the more ancient rites of Memphis and Mizraim. This strengthened the concept in Europe at that time of the Egyptian mystery school tradition. Now, he was actually the last casualty of the Inquisition. He was condemned to death as a heretic, but his death sentence was suspended. Nevertheless, he died in prison in 1795. Any one of those individuals we've talked about thus far may possibly have authored this manuscript. It's suggested by some that the manuscript was authored by the Bavarian Illuminati. This organization, which is usually blamed for everything by conspiracy theorists, was founded in May 1st, 1776. And it was a secret society from the Enlightenment of what were termed freethinkers. So you can see there's these currents of activity going on in Europe at this time. And Egyptomania is reaching its heights. In this organization, members were divided into three classes and pledged obedience to their superiors. Contemporary, well, we've discussed that, but again, they're considered to be the masterminds, and you'll see this in a lot of modern literature that's written about Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. One of the founders of this organization, the Illuminati, was Adam Weishaupt. We're now moving into the 19th century. Born in the 18th century, lived into the 19th century. So we're coming closer. He, as many subsequent Tarotists, were Jesuit educated. And he was a professor of canon law. Does anyone know what that is? It's basically church law. He incorporated his philosophy of Illuminism with Masonry, and the ultimate goal in that philosophy was to perfect human nature. His writings, banned in 1784, were considered seditious by the principality in which he lived. Quite likely, he is the author of this mysterious manuscript that surfaced in the late 18th century. One of his colleagues, Adolf Freiherr Kneidy, didn't quite live as long as him. Initiated into Freemasonry, joined the Illuminati. He broke off with Weistop and abandoned the group. He is one of the possible authors of this as well. How many of you have ever seen Mozart's Magic Flute Opera? Okay, there's 4 of you in here. This tells the story of the ritual of Egyptian initiation, and it is designed almost completely based on this 18th century manuscript. It tells the story of soulmates, trials and tribulations of initiation, and his untimely death was rumored that he had been assassinated for having revealed this secret doctrine. The thing about the European mystery schools, both Rosicrucianism and Masonry, is one had to take oaths of complete secrecy. It's hard to say whether this was secrets being revealed by Mozart and Schikaneder, who was the librettist for the opera, or whether they were actually pushed to reveal this. But it became quite popular. So, occult authors used the Tarot to encode Hermetic and Kabbalistic ideals, assigning different Hebrew letters, astrological signatures to the major arcana, or what we call the trump cards. And subsequent Tarot schools are often focused on one system or the other. You'll find 2 distinct directions have taken place, either the Kabbalistic school or the astrological school, Hermetic school. The Golden Dawn and its followers, those of you who are familiar with builders of the Aditya, are there any Tarot students in the class?
I've been your former student. Does
Yeah.
that help?
Is anyone else familiar with the Tarot? Okay, great. Then if you know this tradition, this includes A.E. Waite and MacGregor Mathers, all studied in the Golden Dawn tradition. So that is a path that's distinctly focused in on Kabbalism. Now the other Tarot key, which comes from the Hermetic school, so the Brotherhood of Light deck places a greater emphasis on Hermetic sciences of astrology and alchemy, and these appear in the symbolisms of their cards. So these are 2 what we would call occult Tarot traditions, and I use the word occult in its Latin meaning, which means hidden or secret. All right, moving up to the middle of the 19th century, Elias Levi. Born Alphonse Louis Constant, he was also a seminarian. And he wrote Dogma and Ritual of High Magic in 1855. And he also wrote The Key of the Great Mysteries in 1861, both revealing both Hermetic and Kabbalistic Tarot. One of the subsequent members in this tradition was Paul Christian, Jean-Baptiste Pitois, and he was also raised in a Catholic monastic community. And he wrote The History of Magic. And in The History of Magic, he basically translated the earlier mysterious manuscript, as we call it, describing Egyptian initiation, which had admonitions assigned to each of the major tarot trumps, and placed this from the German into French. And again, these descriptions are attributed to Iamblichus, but there's actually no evidence that it comes from Iamblichus, and we really are led to conclude that this is a late 18th century manuscript. So his descriptions were actually translated by Genevieve Stebbins, and they were used in the book The Sacred Tarot. Could not find a picture of Christian anywhere, but that is the English translation of his book. Also out of print, sometimes you can find used copies. Gerard Encos, also known as Papas, he was the founder of the Martinist order, Spanish-born French occultist, physician, hypnotist. He was inspired by Elias Levi, and he authored the Divinatory Tarot in 1909. The criticisms of Papas is his anti-Semitism. Although Kabbalism was used throughout his writing, his political views were along one of the more negative currents moving through Europe at that time. Max Theon, as you'll see from a lot of these guys, they have aliases. And there's not a girl yet. So, and there's a reason for that, which most of the audience knows. You don't count, at least in history.
Yet.
Yeah. Women were not considered fit to be authors. They could not find publishers for their work. If they studied this material, quite often they did so in secrecy, borrowing from libraries. It's kind of a guys' club, and a guys' club with wild aliases. And some of them have wild outfits. He was a Polish-Jewish occultist and Kabbalist and became the Grand Master of the Brotherhood of Luxor in 1873. And he's part of the direct tradition of the Brotherhood of Light. I was asked a question earlier as to who some of these gentlemen are on the wall, and there's one picture that you've seen a close facsimile of, and this is Thomas H. Burgoyne. He was the author of The Light of Egypt, born Thomas Henry Dalton. He was a student of Max Theon's in the Brotherhood of Luxor. He was imprisoned in Leeds, England in 1883 on charges of mail fraud, left Scotland for the US with Peter Davidson, and they founded the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor in Georgia as a utopian community. Davidson was from Findhorn, and so they were using esoteric agricultural practices, what was, non-allopathic medical practices at that time in this community. And he was published in articles on the Tarot in the Platinus magazine, and he became the scribe to the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. Appearing shortly after his death was another book. And this was a book by Edgar de Valcourt Vermont, and he wrote under the pseudonym of somebody whose name you've seen before, the Comte de Saint-Germain. And in this book were published the images of the tarot cards in the Egyptian style, along with the admonitions given for each of the images. So coming up to the previous century, the 20th century, C.C. Zane, born Benjamin Williams, but changed his name to Albert Benjamin. A few more aliases here. We know Dalton did so because of his somewhat scandalous past. Zane did so in order to not scandalize his family, who were deacons in the Church of Christ. So he changed his name and moved away. But naturalist, seer, he founded what would you call it? A place for a bird sanctuary in Los Angeles County.
Aviary?
Was it an aviary? It was a natural setting, and he was the head of different naturalist groups in Southern California. But that was his one side. His other side is he was a seer and occultist and authored the 21 Brotherhood of Light lessons, which are those black books you'll see in the shelf over there. That forms the basis of our teachings here. And in 1918, he opened the Brotherhood of Light in Los Angeles, California. And then in 1932, that became a religious nonprofit, the Church of Light. So you can see the origins of our organization are almost contemporaneous with Edgar Cayce. Basically, in 1909, he contacted the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor in Denver, and he was asked to place these teachings in writing, which had become outdated in their time, and asked to put them in contemporary language. Now, his language is outdated. So this year, actually, marks the 100th anniversary of his pledge to the Brotherhood. He wrote the lessons under the pseudonym of C.C. Zane, and that was a repeat. So, the ritual of Egyptian initiation was actually the very first lesson he wrote. That's how much that particular manuscript surfacing in Europe a couple of centuries before had an impact. And he wrote these lessons in pamphlet form, 33 pages each. And later they were bound into books. And in 1915, he, working off of a translation of Paul Christian's work, wrote the Ritual of Egyptian Initiation, around which all of the Brotherhood of Light lessons were centered. So, this is what brings us in Tarot history. It's hard to know sometimes what's actual fact and what's myth. Quite often, oral traditions actually have their roots in something, even if you cannot trace the line of evidence. But in many occult groups, when you can't do that, they assign it to antiquity. And he worked on designing based upon the previous designs that had been done of Egyptian tarot cards, and we'll look at some of them shortly. The Brotherhood of Light Tarot. A quote. Now, in the description of the trials with which Iamblichus has furnished us, the Sphinx of Jesus served as the entrance to the subterranean vaults in which the initiation was conducted. From between the forward limbs, corridors closed by a secret door, ran crypts beneath the Great Pyramid. He's not the only person to claim this. I do remember in the 1970s reading some of Cayce's work, where in one of his trance sequences, he also described subterranean chambers running beneath the Great Pyramids and Sphinx as well. They've never been found. There are some archaeologists who claim to have found them, though the head of antiquities in Egypt at this point claims that it's not true. So We don't know, but certainly there's more than one source that certainly claims that these places were in existence. He continues to say, at one point in his journey, the candidate is stopped before the 22 frescoed paintings which picture the 22 major arcanum of the Tarot, and it becomes his duty to commit to memory these pictures as well as their symbolism, which is then explained to him, as these pictures, together with such of their symbolism as is then explained to the neophyte, are fully described by Iamblichus. His work affords an accurate description of the Tarot. So, at the time he was writing, he was certainly assuming the authenticity of that manuscript, as everyone before him had. It's only been in the last 20 years that more research has been done in this. Those are some of the images of the first 4 major arcanum. Now, there have been a couple dozen Egyptian-themed tarot cards published. Basically over the last century, if not longer. So the theme and the myth of the Egyptian origins holds very strong in Tarot tradition. The first was the Falconier-Wegener Tarot, 1896, the 22 Hermetic Leaves of Divinatory Tarot. All of the subsequent Egyptian decks follow these descriptions, basically. This is the deck that was published by Vermont in 1901. Same story, excerpts from Christian. 1933, the Brotherhood of Light Tarot was designed. You can see the images are so closely related, and at that time, none of these authors thought they were plagiarizing anything. Basically, it was their view that this was the, ancient historic occult tradition that was being preserved for contemporary generations. Nowadays, something so closely matching another person's work would be brought under suspicion, but again, they were attributed to being drawings from antiquity. So the Sacred Tarot is actually based on using images from this the previous deck that we looked at.
Excuse me.
Vicky Brewer redesigned this in 2003, sitting in the back of the room there. Sort of cleaned up the lines. Shortly thereafter, there was a Russian deck produced using her vector images, with adding a little bit of color. And just this year, she's completed a full color deck, which we're getting the proofs back from US Game Systems probably tomorrow, and it should be in print perhaps by the beginning of next year. So, in the Zane Tarot, he calls he claims that there are 2 keys to unlock the door to the Temple of Solomon. There's a gold key and a silver key. The gold key is what we call the written tradition. Corresponds to science, astrology, and the sun, the planet that rules the metal gold. The silver key is the oral tradition, and it corresponds to divination or the tarot and the moon. So in his system, just as the moon reflects the light of the sun, the tarot are the pictured images of astrology. So the Brotherhood of Light system, as we looked before, there you either have Kabbalistic systems and or astrological systems. This is truly what we'd call an astrological system, although there are Hebrew letters on each of the cards. That's about the only thing that might indicate a Kabbalistic tradition. Where do we see these two keys today?
People,
Yeah, the seal of the Vatican. So we'd love to get into their library. Now, as an astrological tarot, the 22 major arcana are broken down into the 12 signs and 10 planets. 36 minors correspond to 36 decanates, or the 10-degree sections of the zodiac. The 4 tens corresponded to the 4 changes, or the seasons that take place throughout the year. And the court arcanum represented 12 distinct personalities, or the houses in an astrological chart. Are there any students of astrology in the room? Okay, then you'll know what I'm talking about here. So that's the tarot key. Yes?
sorry, what is a decimate?
A decan, it comes from the word decan, which means 10. And the ancient Egyptians divided the sky not only into 12 signs, but into 36 10-degree sections. So if you figure the whole circle's 360 degrees, divided by 36 is 10.
Oh, okay.
So they assigned a constellation to each of those 10 degrees, which could be seen rising on the eastern horizon before the sun at certain times of the year.
Okay, that makes sense.
Oh.
I must say, in comment, you've gotten quite fancy with your PowerPoint presentations there.
Well, thank you. Zane in the Sacred Tarot says, as the Tarot is a pictorial synthesis of the universe, not only must it correspond to astrological influences, but also to the various divisions. Oops, I jumped ahead. The various divisions of time which are measured by these influences. Here's another quote on divination. This comes from the Doctrine of Divination. Divination is the act of foreseeing or foretelling future events or discovering information not accessible through the exercise of reason and the ordinary physical senses. All right, let's talk about some divination. Does anyone recognize this? Oracle at Delphi. She would sit on a tripod above a cleft in the earth where apparently some type of volcanic vapors escaped. The thing about the Oracle at Delphi is nobody knew what the heck she was saying except for her interpreter, who wrote everything down in iambic pentameter. So whenever you read, it's like, oh, who was the French prognosticator, Nostradamus. It's like reading Nostradamus, reading the Oracle of Delphi. It's very poetic. What do we have going on here? Crystal ball reader. Here's another form of divination, oftentimes referred to as scrying, is that individuals may use a crystal ball, a bowl of water, a bright shiny object, a blackened mirror, but reflective surfaces are used by some diviners in order to get information. And they see images appearing on the surface of that shiny object. Have any of you ever worked with a well witch?
Very successfully.
Very successfully, she says. Once when I was 18, there was an old Pomo Indian well witch in Northern California where I lived, who was doing all the wells locally. And he used a willow rod. And to show us how it worked, he had us blindfold him. I had very long hair at the time. It was the early 70s. And he tied a strand of that around the end of his divining rod. He had us all scatter. And blindfolded, he was able to locate me.
Wow.
What about this?
I Ching.
I Ching. We'll actually get a... So, I Ching is either done with coins or traditionally with yarrow sticks. They're thrown down, and the patterns are read and compared to a book. The patterns in which they fall bring up aphorisms, basically, out of the book. What are these? Anybody worked with these? What do? You shake them, you throw them down, and you discern information from the patterns that come up. We had some folks here a few years back who were doing a similar form of divination, only using colored stones from a pouch. And the color of stone that fell, where the stones fell in relationship to one another, was all a means of divining information. Does anyone know what this is? This is Ifa, which comes out of the Yoruba tradition of West Africa, where cowrie shells are thrown onto the table of Ifa from the cup, and the pattern in which the cowrie shells basically divine the will of the Orishas, or the gods of West Africa. Also in West Africa, I think this is in Jablong. I don't know if you can see what he has there, but there's a crab in that bowl. This is a diviner who foretells the future based on the movements of the crab. If that's not working for you, there are the lumps on your head. In the 19th century, this was very popular, phrenology. For some, there's chiromancy, reading the lines in a palm. And if you're thirsty, drink your coffee. You can read from the patterns and the grounds. Information. We're looking at, what's coming up in the future. If you don't like coffee, you can always do tea leaves. So these are all forms of divination. And in every form of divination, there is something going on. The tarot is just one form of divination. And the way divination works is based on the concept that we live in two environments. Basically, we're all familiar with our physical bodies and the environment that we function in. But we also have a soul or an unconscious mind or subconscious mind that functions in a dimension above the speed of light. And we call these basically the two planes. The outer plane, that's actually incorrect number. It's 186,172 miles per second. The inner plane was referred to as the ancients as the astral. Any ideas why? Astral means of a star. And it's believed that it was on this plane that the stellar influences manifested. In the astral plane, which operates above the speed of light, it's where our soul or subconscious mind resides. Another way of looking at that, the inner plane is separated from the outer plane by what's called the etheric boundary line energy. At least I'm consistent in my errors. It's dangerous if I drive some way the wrong way for the first time. Whenever I return, I try to go back the same way. So, here's our soul, or our subconscious, residing above the speed of light, and the physical body below that, in the material plane, in the physical plane. Now what happens is the astral plane or the inner plane is not necessarily separate from the physical. We might say that it is interior to. It is a finer substance that's vibrating at a much higher frequency. Things basically happen there before manifesting in the slower moving physical substance.
Christopher, you have a question.
Yes. Oh, I can see your hand now.
On the previous screen, it said the outer plane was astral and the inner plane was physical. And why are they switched here?
If so,
I'm sorry.
I made a mistake, but it looks like I got it right.
Outer plane is
And we have, the question was invalid. I don't mind going back. So, basically, what we are doing when we're trying to contact the inner plane, which is what we do in divination of any kind, whether you're throwing your I Ching, yarrow, or coins, your runes, your colored stones, your tarot cards, your tea leaves, your coffee grounds, there is a direct relationship between the subconscious or soul and the physical, which is called psychokinesis. Psycho, mind, kinesis, moves. So in a sense, the mind moves matter. The way we move across that boundary line is oftentimes we have to build up our energy, which is done through rhythmic breathing. Breathing, not breathing. Not rhythmic breathing.
Sounds familiar.
All right. Zane went on to say, man has a physical body and he has an astral body. The physical body, and through its nerve currents, which are electrical in nature, his mind or soul, which resides on the inner plane, the small, emergent part being the objective mind, and the submerged part, the unconscious mind, are influenced by his outer plane environment. His astral body and his mind or soul are influenced by his inner plane environment, and the thought cells so affected in turn influence his physical body. Thus does man live in and is influenced by both an outer plane world and an inner plane world. So, that is the greatest obstacle to ESP. It's your mind. How many of you have ever had an intuitive awareness, started to rationalize or talk yourself out of something? The event came to pass as you had originally had an instinct, and you wanted to kick yourself down the stairs afterwards. Yeah. What happens? Once we start engaging in cerebral thinking, it blocks the access to the unconscious mind. Why? Because consciousness goes where the attention is held. If it's held in the reasoning part of your brain, that's where your consciousness is. To get it to the inner plane, to contact information, where you basically tune into a lifeline. Some people call it the Akashic Records, or there are other names for it. But you tune into that information, and then you're bringing it back. When you're doing tarot cards, through the process of shuffling and cutting, the psychokinesis takes place. The unconscious mind is arranging these symbols into a pattern that will bring up the desired information to the conscious mind. Got that? Okay. That's how it works. Simple, huh? So, here's an example. One of our teachers at work here. She doesn't always dress like that, though. It was a special event. When you go to do a reading, what you first have to do is choose an environment. Environment has a big factor. My mentor, a man by the name of Jesse Montoya, although he was involved in a lot of dubious practices, one of which was he would go to the racetrack and go into the toilet and do his readings on the toilet seat. which horse is going to win.
Oh,
He discovered that that environment was not the most successful place for him to do readings because of the thought forms created by all of the emotional people thinking this horse or that horse or this horse would win. So you choose a peaceful environment in your home, a place to work. You have to set a mood. Some people might do this through essential oils or incense or using special music or putting on a particular color, etc. But you create a state of mind, basically, which is what a mood is, a mental emotional state. You formulate a question when you go to do a reading. You're basically setting guidelines for your unconscious mind. When you're doing a reading, you're asking your unconscious to jump through hoops for you, like a performing circus animal. Fetch. I want information about this. So, and then you decide how you want that information to come to you. These are what we call spreads with tarot, and they're patterns in which the cards are laid out. So we're telling the subconscious mind, Fido, or Butch, or whatever you want to call your subconscious mind, that, okay, this is the information I want, and I want it to come up in this format. That's how I want it to be revealed to me. So you're setting up the parameters or the boundaries for which your subconscious can function. The next thing you really need to do is cultivate a sincere desire for the truth. Hard to do, because guess what? We're all subjective. We really do have desired outcomes. But it's actually more valuable to get the truth than to just get a reflection of our desired outcome. So we have to cultivate objectivity. We increase our electrification. We discussed that earlier, which is through rhythmic breathing. Or rhythmic breathing. Cards are shuffled and cut, and they're laid out in a particular spread. They're turned over one at a time to reveal the information. Got that? You'll be tested later. So, the tarot is primarily known for its use in divination. There are few people today that know the tarot as a game system as it was used back in Italy in the late 15th century. But the tarot images are considered to be icons for meditation and contemplation. In the Hermetic system, they represent different steps on the road of initiation. All right, back to Jung. Swiss psychiatrist and founder of the Jungian psychology, believed that humans had a religious nature and sought to explore the human psyche through the realms of art, dreams, and mythology. He is the person who coined the term archetypes. Now, the unconscious mind communicates with us in two ways. And this is important to know in any form of divination you might be using, and in particular with tarot. Basically, the unconscious mind has two methods of communicating: feelings and symbols. In the realm of symbols, there are two types of symbols: what we would call personal symbols and universal symbols. What are universal symbols? Things we all recognize. You better be able to recognize that, each and every one of you. Not to do your tarot readings at the racetrack, but in times of need. These are valuable symbols. Almost all of us recognize these other symbols here. They're universal symbols. Personal symbols, on the other hand, are something that is quite personal and unique to us. And this is oftentimes the that very rich material that makes up our dream life. So what is a symbol? Well, I've already given you the answer here. Symbol is that which represents something else. Symbols of the world religions. When we think about something, we either think about its name, or we picture it, or we do both. In our mind, is the thing actually in our mind? No. The symbol of the thing, either through the word that we associate with it, or the image we associate with it, is in our mind. Oh, those valuable symbols again. A word is a symbol that represents a person, place, object, action, or abstract idea. You may not know where we're going yet, but I do. Written language is dependent upon symbols. Pictograph writing. Here's an example. What do you think that is?
Fire.
In Chinese culture, it's clear to them that that's fire. Now, in phonetic writing, each letter represents a sound. So the reason I'm talking about symbols is the Tarot is actually written in a language, and it's written in a language that's called the symbolical pictograph. We've already determined what a symbol is, that which represents something else. What is a pictograph? It's picture writing, basically. But here, it is only necessary to trace it from its simple beginning as a visual pictograph image to the next step, which is the visual symbolical pictograph. Yet the necessity is urgent to make clear at this point that pictographs and symbolical pictographs not only were the first visual images used by the race in communication of ideas from one to another, but that, because they represent obvious associations, they are the images still employed by the unconscious mind. This is why symbolism is so important and why the Tarot has been maintained over hundreds of years as a valuable means of getting information, is that we associate meanings with symbol. He goes on to say, as thought is impossible without the use of symbols, it will be seen that the study of symbolism is the study of the counters of thought. The study of Masonic symbolism then becomes the study of the thoughts and ideas of the ancient master minds, as expressed by them in the language of universal symbolism. Well knowing the transitory nature of arbitrary language, the words of one generation often having an opposite meaning in the next, these sages spoke and wrote in a language, the words of which would never change their import, thus preserving their thoughts in their original purity for all time. Time out. Take a 5-minute break.